I'd just like to be remembered for being a compassionate human being, to be born at a time when there was this fabulous thing called television that could allow me to use all the talents that I'd been given.
When a sealed drawer belonging to Fred Rogers, the beloved face of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, was finally opened, no one expected what they found inside. Hidden away for decades was a letter that revealed a side of Rogers few ever knew. One filled with haunting confessions and emotional secrets that left even his closest friends stunned. But how could the world's most gentle, compassionate man carry such a burden in silence? Today, we uncover the disturbing truth behind the letter that changed everything about Fred Rogers. The hidden drawer and the letter that changed everything. It began quietly, in a dimly lit room at the Fred Rogers Center in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Joanne Rogers stood beside two archivists, her hands trembling slightly as they pulled open the small mahogany drawer that had remained locked since her husband's passing in 2003. Fred had told her to keep its contents private while he was alive, but he never said what to do after he was gone. Inside were dozens of neatly folded pages, each one dated, his handwriting careful, deliberate, unmistakably his. Every year, on his birthday, Fred wrote a letter to God. At first, the notes were what you might expect from the gentle host of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood: reflections on kindness, gratitude, the children who had written to him, and prayers for strength to keep doing good. But as Joanne and the archivists sifted through the stack, one letter stopped them cold. It wasn't just personal, it was unsettling. The words on that page were heavier than anything Fred had ever said aloud. He questioned whether his entire life's work had truly mattered, whether the millions of children he'd comforted had really been helped. "Have I been loved enough," he wrote, "or did I only love the idea of being kind?" The line struck Joanne deeply. To the world, Fred Rogers was the very embodiment of gentleness and grace, a man who never raised his voice, never sought fame, and never let bitterness touch his words. But the tone of this letter was different. It was as if the man who had spent decades assuring children that they were special was now confessing that he didn't always believe it about himself. There was doubt, guilt, and an ache for forgiveness that felt almost confessional. For those who read it, it was like hearing a hymn turn into a cry for help. As they looked further, they realized this was no isolated moment of self-reflection. Over 30 such letters were tucked inside that drawer, written through the years, tracing his quiet battle with faith, identity, and purpose. The archivists recognized references to a manuscript Fred had written back in 1986, one that publishers refused to print for being too raw. That manuscript, titled The World of Mr. Rogers, revealed sides of him few ever imagined. Scars from teenage acne he tried to cover with makeup, long nights wrestling with anger, and his fear that the world saw him as a saint when he was still learning how to be human. Reading that drawer's contents was like hearing Fred's voice stripped of its television warmth, still gentle, but unbearably human. These weren't letters for history books or documentaries. They were private prayers from a man who had spent his life soothing others but seldom allowed himself the same grace. Joanne closed the drawer slowly, tears in her eyes. She whispered what Fred often said on screen: "It's okay to feel sad." And for the first time, perhaps, those words belonged entirely to him. So what happens when the man who taught millions to love themselves begins to doubt his own worth? Keep watching. What Fred wrote when no one was watching. The more Joanne read, the clearer it became. Fred Rogers hadn't been writing for comfort. He had been writing to confront something. in the privacy of those letters, the man America knew as endlessly patient and unfailingly kind was wrestling with a deep unease. The tone shifted between gratitude and guilt, faith and fear. He wondered aloud whether his fame had turned his message into something hollow, whether people were seeing him as a symbol instead of a man. One line in particular pierced through the illusion of perfection he had carried for decades. "What if I have become the image I tried to protect? Children from believing in someone too good to be real." To millions, Fred Rogers had been the calm voice that made childhood feel safe. But when no one was watching, his pen traced the doubts that even kindness could not silence. He asked questions that echoed like small prayers. Have I listened enough? Have I given enough? Have I confused being gentle with being silent? Each word hinted at the quiet exhaustion of a man burdened by expectation. Behind the red cardigan and the soft piano melodies, there was a constant fear that if the world ever saw his cracks, the entire message might fall apart. Among the letters, Joanne found several references to his unpublished 1986 manuscript, The World of Mr. Rogers. That manuscript, kept hidden in a separate drawer, was perhaps his truest self-portrait. Publishers had refused to print it, calling it too personal. But to Fred, it was a necessary confession. He had written about his lifelong struggle with self-image, describing the scars left by severe acne during his teenage years and the shame that lingered into adulthood. He wrote about spending hours in front of mirrors, learning how to apply makeup to cover the marks, a practice he quietly carried into his television years. It wasn't vanity. It was armor. Fred's writing revealed that his gentle on-screen persona was not effortless grace, but disciplined restraint. The man who told children it was okay to feel angry had spent decades mastering his own anger, shaping it into music, puppetry, and empathy. He admitted that the sermons he wrote for others were often messages he needed himself. In one passage, he confessed to envying those who could express rage without guilt. "I've built a life on kindness, but sometimes kindness feels like a disguise for fear." Was this a confession, or a warning to the rest of us about the cost of kindness? Joanne later said that Fred's greatest fear wasn't death or failure, but being remembered as a saint. He worked hard at being good, she explained, but he never thought he was good. The letters proved that. They weren't proof of hypocrisy, they were proof of honesty. Behind the cardigan and the calm voice was a man who understood that kindness, at its purest form, demands everything, even the courage to admit when you're not okay. So where did this quiet ache begin? The need to heal others while hiding his own pain. Stay tuned. The boy who needed a friend. Long before he became the nation's kindest neighbor, Fred Rogers was just a lonely boy staring out the window of a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. The Rogers estate in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, stretched across 47 acres, with heated floors, marble staircases, and servants who answered every call. Yet, to young Fred, it was unbearably quiet. His father, James, was a stern businessman who spent long hours at the steel plant, and his mother, Nancy, while loving, often busied herself with church work and charity visits. There were toys, books, and space to run, but no one to run with. That silence became his first companion. At just 2 years old, Fred fell dangerously ill with both measles and scarlet fever. A terrifying diagnosis during the Great Depression, when many children never recovered. He spent 47 days confined to bed, feverish and weak, hallucinating from pain. His mother sat beside him every night, gently teaching him to play soft melodies on the black piano keys because his fingers were too frail to press the white ones. That small act of tenderness changed everything. Each note became an emotion, each sound, a language his words couldn't yet express. From then on, music wasn't just sound for Fred, it was survival. When he turned 3, his developmental struggles became more visible. Doctors diagnosed him with dyspraxia, a coordination disorder so severe that he couldn't tie his shoes or hold a spoon properly. One doctor even suggested sending him to an institution. Instead, his parents brought in a physical therapist named Margaret Thompson, who introduced him to something that would shape his destiny: puppetry. She placed a tiny cloth puppet on his hand and made him wave it to a tune. Slowly, Fred's weak fingers began to move with rhythm and purpose. 6 months later, his coordination had improved 3-fold. For the rest of his life, he would remember that simple truth, that play could heal what medicine could not. But the world outside his home wasn't nearly as kind. By high school, Fred was tall, thin, and painfully shy, with a high-pitched voice that made him a target. Classmates called him Fat Freddy and Squeaky, shoving him into lockers and mocking him when he tried to play piano at school assemblies. Once, they poured chocolate milk over his sheet music while he played. The humiliation was crushing. Yet instead of hardening him, those moments planted the first seeds of empathy. Fred began to understand pain not as something to avenge, but something to acknowledge, gently, honestly. Alone in his attic, he built a world that finally made sense to him. Using old socks, he created puppet characters with voices that reflected parts of himself: brave, curious, scared, and kind. His favorite was a small felt figure he named David the Dreamer. David spoke for him when he couldn't. In those solitary performances for stuffed animals, Fred learned how to communicate without judgment, to see the world as a place that needed listening, not correction. His grandmother, who often visited the mansion, became another lifeline. She was unafraid to discuss big questions with him about God, suffering, and the mystery of love. When Fred once asked, "Why does God let kids suffer?" she smiled and said, "God wants us to wonder." That single answer stayed with him forever. To her, asking wasn't doubt, it was faith. And it's no coincidence that decades later, the same boy who once questioned everything built a career around helping children do the same: to feel, to ask, and to be heard. Those childhood years, heavy with silence, illness, and longing, were the crucible that formed the Fred Rogers the world came to love. Which is why, decades later, when Joanne found his letter filled with guilt and self-doubt, it struck her so deeply. The man who had once been the lonely boy in the attic, who had turned his pain into compassion for millions, still carried that loneliness inside him. His empathy wasn't born of peace. It was born of pain he never truly escaped. But how does a boy shaped by loneliness face the real world? Watch closely. Faith, television, and the burden of perfection. By the time Fred Rogers left behind the shadows of his lonely childhood, one thing had become clear. He didn't just want to be understood, he wanted to help others feel understood too. Music had taught him empathy, puppetry had given him a voice, and faith soon became his compass. After graduating from Rollins College with a degree in music composition, Fred found himself drawn towards something larger than performance: the search for purpose. The quiet boy who once questioned why God allowed children to suffer now wanted to answer that question in his own way. But the world he stepped into was louder than anything he'd known. In 1951, at just 23, Fred landed what many would have called a dream job, working behind the scenes at NBC in New York. He was surrounded by big lights, big names, and bigger egos. The industry buzzed with excitement, but to Fred, it felt hollow. Between ad breaks and cue cards, he saw adults throwing pies at each other and calling it children's entertainment. The laughter was forced, the lessons meaningless. After only 6 weeks, he'd had enough. Without warning, Fred walked out of the studio, leaving his dream job behind. "I've seen enough," he told his colleagues quietly. It wasn't anger, it was disillusionment. That moment became the first of many moral stands. It wasn't that Fred hated television, he hated what it was becoming. He saw its power to shape minds, to reach homes, to teach, but it was being wasted. When he returned to Pittsburgh a few years later, he made a vow. If he was going to work in television again, it would be on his own terms. He joined WQED, America's first community-funded educational station, and started co-creating the Children's Corner. It was small, poorly funded, and constantly improvisational. But it was real. Fred wrote music, voiced puppets, played the organ, and poured his soul into every episode. During his lunch breaks, he enrolled at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and studied child psychology under Dr. Margaret McFarland. While others studied for the pulpit, Fred prepared for something far less traditional. He wanted to be ordained not to preach in a church, but to serve children through television. In 1963, he was officially ordained a Presbyterian minister with that exact mission. Still, the emotional cost of carrying that mission was immense. Every word he spoke on screen had to live up to the moral ideal he had built for himself. Every episode carried the expectation of calmness, patience, and love, even when Fred himself was tired, angry, or scared. Joanne often said that the pressure to remain perfect in the eyes of the public weighed on him more heavily than anyone realized. Perhaps that was the fatigue hinted at in his hidden letter. The quiet confession of a man who had spent his life soothing others while privately wrestling with exhaustion. Could that letter have been less about doubt and more about release? Maybe, after decades of carrying the burden of being everyone's gentle neighbor, Fred Rogers was finally admitting what he never could on camera, that even kindness, when lived so fully, can become a cross to bear. So was this the cost of carrying so much care? Keep watching to find out. When kindness met the cruel world. But the burden of being everyone's gentle neighbor didn't stay confined to the television screen. It followed Fred Rogers into the real world, where kindness often collided with cruelty. For years, he had shouldered that responsibility quietly, using calm words to reach troubled children and weary parents alike. Yet, as his fame grew, so did the weight of expectation. People didn't just admire Fred, they depended on him. And in a world that often rewarded loudness over compassion, his gentleness began to feel like an act of defiance. That defiance reached its most defining moment in 1969. Public television was on the brink of collapse, with the Nixon administration threatening to slash its funding in half. Instead of lobbying with big names or money, Fred went alone to Washington, armed with nothing but sincerity. Facing Senator John Pastore, a man known for his impatience, Fred didn't deliver a speech. He shared a song. "What do you do with the mad that you feel?" he asked softly, reciting words he'd written for children struggling with anger. The room fell silent. When he finished, Pastore leaned forward, visibly moved, and said, "Looks like you just earned $20 million. That quiet moment of courage saved PBS. But not every battle ended so gracefully. A year later, in the midst of America's racial unrest, Fred used his show to deliver another silent sermon. In a simple scene, he invited Francois Clemens, who played Officer Clemens, the first black man to have a recurring role on children's television, to sit beside him and soak their feet together in a small wading pool. The gesture was small, wordless, but powerful. In a country where even public pools were still segregated, that image sent a message louder than any speech. Love has no color. Yet Southern stations refused to air the episode. Hundreds of angry letters poured in, some filled with slurs. Still, Fred wrote back personally, calm, firm, unbroken. Years later, a far darker distortion of his message emerged. In 1990, the Ku Klux Klan created fake recordings mimicking Fred's gentle voice, spreading racist hate in schools. The very voice that had once brought peace to millions was twisted into something vile. For one of the few times in his life, Fred fought back with the full force of the law. The tapes were destroyed, but the emotional toll was lasting. He had dedicated his life to teaching kindness and watched his own words weaponized by cruelty. Each public stand he took, whether before Congress, in a backyard pool, or against the Klan, deepened his private exhaustion. The world saw a calm man in a cardigan, but behind that warmth was someone who constantly battled to protect the fragile space of innocence he'd created. The cost of being the symbol of kindness in a harsh world was steep. Fred bore it with grace. But in the end, the letters in that locked drawer revealed what the world never saw, that even kindness, when tested long enough, begins to ache. His final years and the meaning behind the words. Every quiet act of courage took something from him, and by the late 1990s, the toll began to show. Fred Rogers was slowing down, though he rarely admitted it. The man who once swam 3 miles every morning and wrote scripts until dawn now tired easily. Then, in 1998, came the diagnosis: stomach cancer. He was 70, and though doctors urged him to rest, Fred refused to step away from the work that had defined his life. Between chemotherapy sessions, he filmed 65 more episodes, sometimes pausing mid-taping to regain strength before returning to the set with his familiar smile. Behind that gentle composure was a man quietly preparing for goodbye. He began praying longer each morning, reading from his handwritten list of names, hundreds of children who had once written to him. For over 2 decades, he had prayed for each one individually. His producers later said that this ritual wasn't public piety, but a promise he had made to himself. If a child trusts me with their pain, the least I can do is carry it. When filming finally ended in December 2000, he recorded one last message for his viewers, his voice weaker but still steady. It wasn't a farewell, it was gratitude. 2 years later, on February 27, 2003, Fred Rogers passed away in his Pittsburgh home, surrounded by his family. Years afterwards, as Joanne revisited his locked drawer, she came across that final letter. The one that ended with a line that read like both apology and prayer: "I hope I was kind enough to be forgiven." Was it peace he was making with God, or a quiet warning about how even goodness can fracture beneath the weight of expectation? Beside that letter rests his iconic red sweater, still weighing exactly 2.7 pounds, the same weight Fred once said carried every bit of love he gave away, and every sorrow he never spoke aloud. So, what do you think Fred wanted the world to learn from that drawer? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories like this.